You have a tremendous following. You're very outspoken. Do you worry that you could be censored and banned?
Yeah, I have been censored and banned in some regards. I It's kind of baked into my strategy from the very start because I started on TikTok where there is the most censorship of any platform right now. I learned pretty early on how the AIs that are in our algorithms sort of watch our content and censor us based on keywords, censor us based on topics. So I learned a lot of strategies for how to avoid sort of the algorithmic censorship. And then I also diversified across a wide array of platforms so that I am censorship resistant. Um, and I accrued enough of a following base that I have enough subscriber support now that just support me because of what I do, not because of any specific views on any specific videos. That now, even if I was taken off of all the platforms, I would still be able to keep on supporting myself and doing the research I do and publish it somewhere else. So there's a strategy to getting around the censorship in this modern world, for better or for worse. We are supposed to have free speech, but in reality, I think the job of an independent journalist today is to protect their free speech, not just to exercise it as well.
So, what are some of the keywords that we should stay away from to make sure we don't get banned?
It depends on the platform, somewhat ironically. TikTok shows us sort of all the censorship at once. And so, in my experience, the things that get most censored on TikTok are anything that aligns with sort of the military industrial intelligence complex's agendas. That includes the CIA, that includes the forever wars, whether it's the Ukraine war or the Israel-Palestine conflict. That includes a lot of the big corporate industries, some of the untouchable corporate industries like big pharma, COVID, and the vaccines. It includes things like anything to do with elections, because the CIA is very concerned with elections. Of course, only overseas. They would never be concerned with ours. But it's ironic and it's abhorrent that actually TikTok censors videos discussing our free and fair elections, even ones that aren't conspiracy theories, even ones that are just talking about elections. They censor us Americans talking about elections as if they say it is election interference, or like election integrity is their buzzword, because they're protecting our elections by censoring our First Amendment free speech about our elections, which is the most just asinine thing I could ever imagine. But that kind of runs the gambit, is anything that is sort of part of the establishment, like public culture war narrative or real war narrative. Those are the most sensitive topics.
What are your views on Gaza, Israel?
They're always evolving and they're very complex, especially to bring with no context. But in general, I didn't have strong views on it at all until I started, ironically, researching it for a different piece that overlapped with Israel and Gaza, and I felt uninformed. This was back last year, like in August and September of last year. And I realized how uninformed I was about it. And so I started doing my own research piece about Israel and Gaza, and I actually finished it and published it on October 6th, which I could never have imagined how weird that timing would have been. And my views then, when I finished that research piece, and my views still to this day, are that I see Israel as having entered into their state initially on the backs of an immense power and money complex of both the Rothschild banking empire, being literally the people in the Balfour Declaration who were assigned this land by the British Empire, all the way to the financing of the initial Israeli state by massive financial interests, being armed and supplied by the Jewish mob, sending weapons from America to the paramilitary groups that were fighting for the founding of Israel. And then those paramilitary groups that were fighting for the founding of Israel all being so intense that the government of Israel, newly formed, had to label them all as terrorist organizations because they had essentially been committing acts of terrorism in order to found that state. And the people that led all of those groups went on to lead Israel for the next 20 to 30 years. So my view on Israel is that its founding, whether you feel like its founding was justified or not, it was founded by some pretty harsh people that had a lot of violence in their past and large amounts of money backing what they were doing. And that tends to lead to corruption when you have people that can commit violence and have lots of money. And when you look at the history of Israel, there is an incredible amount of corruption, an incredible amount of doing things that are unconscionable for the sake of the survival of the state. And I would put Jeffrey Epstein in that bucket. More and more, the evidence is stacking up that Jeffrey Epstein was an Israeli operation, right down to Ehud Barak, the ex-prime minister of Israel, being what looks to have been Jeffrey Epstein's handler, both in the 80s and all the way through the 2000s. So my opinion is that I am not a huge fan of Israel's state and their government and their policies. I would be one of those Israelis that is out there protesting Bibi Netanyahu's regime. But I also don't think it's simple. I think that there is an argument to be made. Like, I don't think that you can, like, the camp that goes like all Jews are bad and like all Jews should, like, that is not helpful at all. That is super destructive to a productive conversation. There's no simple way out of it, but I certainly don't think that bombing civilians in Gaza is doing any good for Gazans. But I also think that it is the leading cause of like this new anti-Semitism in the world too, because it's just on full display in front of all of us how uncompromising that regime is, regardless of the human life consequences and regardless of the political consequences overseas too.
In your opinion, what is anti-Semitism?
Great question.
People see it differently.
It's getting thrown around so much these days. And I speak on this a fair bit too, that I think that anti-Semitism is getting wildly overused by people that are defending Israel, from passing legislation in America that's like sort of criticizing the Israeli government with anti-Semitism in our own laws, as well as just people online throwing the anti-Semite label at someone who says, I don't support the war in Gaza. And that debases the value of that term, because violence against Jewish people because they are Jewish is a very real historical phenomenon, just like violence against Black people is a very real historical phenomenon. And we need a word reserved for real violence against groups of people because they're in that group. And if you start to throw that word around just because someone is having a complex political discussion about the state of Israel, or even if you like, that label gets thrown at me just for talking about Jeffrey Epstein and saying that Jeffrey Epstein looks like he was Mossad, that starts to make the word anti-Semitism mean less and less and less every time it gets used. In the exact same way that today the word racist is like the new most common insult. And it makes it so that when you actually call someone a racist, it's not really like racism is getting debased in the same way, where we no longer have a word that's strong enough to condemn the truly condemnable.
Okay, so you touched on Epstein. Clarify that.
It's hard to explain in any sort of short form style, because any kind of conclusion about an intelligence agency operation or a conclusion about like a sex trafficking ring has to be based on a ton of evidence, because like I said earlier, it's all obfuscated and it's all designed to be deniable, plausible deniability. But for anyone that hasn't read Whitney Webb's book, One Nation Under Blackmail, it's a 2-volume book that is the most well-sourced and complete examination of the entire Jeffrey Epstein network, the things that led to it, the people that were involved in it, the people that brought him to power, the people that engaged with him and helped him. It's the most complete assessment done to date by far, and it paints a very clear picture.